October 1971. Sea of Okhotsk, 400 feet beneath the surface. USS Halibut maintained position against a gentle current as saturation divers emerged from the lockout chamber. Commander John McNish monitored the operation from the control room, watching depth gauges and acoustic sensors with intense concentration. The submarine was operating in restricted Soviet waters, 50 miles from the Kamchatka Peninsula, conducting a mission that would become the most successful intelligence operation of the Cold War. The divers located the Soviet underwater cable exactly where intelligence analysts predicted it would be. Ironically, the Soviet Navy had helpfully marked the cable route with warning buoys to prevent their own trawlers from damaging it. American intelligence photographs from reconnaissance satellites showed the markers clearly. Following the markers to their logical conclusion led directly to the cable itself. The recording device weighed 6 tons. Deploying it required precision maneuvering by the submarine and careful handling by divers working in near-total darkness. Induction coils wrapped around the cable without cutting it or interrupting service. Batteries would power the system for approximately 1 year. Magnetic tape storage would record every signal that passed through the cable until the submarine returned to retrieve the data and install a fresh pod. At 23:40 hours, the divers signaled successful installation. Commander McNish ordered quiet withdrawal from the area. USS Halibut departed Soviet waters at minimum speed, remaining undetected. Behind them, the recording device began capturing Soviet Pacific Fleet communications, orders to submarine commanders, telemetry from missile tests, operational reports from surface vessels, command directives from Moscow to fleet headquarters in Petropavlovsk. The Soviet Union believed the cable was secure. For the next 9 years, they would be catastrophically wrong. For the Soviet Navy, underwater communication cables represented the ultimate in secure communications. Radio transmissions could be intercepted by American signals intelligence stations scattered across the Pacific. Satellite communications were vulnerable to electronic eavesdropping. But cables buried on the ocean floor, running through restricted Soviet waters, protected by geography and depth, these were assumed to be absolutely secure. The Sea of Okhotsk had been designated a Soviet maritime sanctuary. Surrounded almost entirely by Soviet territory, with only narrow straits connecting it to the Pacific Ocean, the sea served as a protected bastion for Soviet submarine operations. Ballistic missile submarines operated from Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula, deploying into the Sea of Okhotsk, where they could remain under the protective cover of Soviet naval aviation and surface forces. Communication cables connected Petropavlovsk Naval Base to mainland command centers, carrying the most sensitive traffic the Soviet military transmitted: submarine patrol orders, fleet deployment schedules, nuclear command and control messages, missile test coordination. Every critical operational communication that couldn't wait for courier delivery traveled through those cables. Soviet engineers had installed coaxial cables capable of carrying voice and data traffic. The communications were encrypted using military-grade cipher systems. But Soviet security doctrine assumed that physical security provided the primary protection. No one could access a cable lying 400 feet underwater in restricted waters patrolled constantly by Soviet warships and submarines. The technology underlying cable security seemed unassailable. To intercept cable communications by traditional methods required cutting the cable, splicing in recording equipment, and somehow concealing the interruption. Such an operation would be detected immediately. Service interruptions would trigger investigations. Repair crews would discover the tap. The operation would fail before collecting any useful intelligence. Soviet communication security experts understood induction technology existed in theory. Wrapping coils around a cable could detect electromagnetic fields without physically penetrating the cable's protective sheathing. But implementing such technology at 400 feet depth in Soviet territorial waters seemed impossible. The technical challenges were insurmountable. American submarines couldn't operate undetected in the Sea of Okhotsk. American divers couldn't work at those depths for the time required. Recording equipment couldn't survive the pressure and cold for extended periods. Every assumption was wrong. KGB counterintelligence units monitored for American submarine incursions. Sonar nets and acoustic sensors covered approaches to Soviet naval bases. Surface vessels and aircraft conducted regular patrols. Any American submarine detected in Soviet territorial waters would trigger immediate response forces. The risk of capture or destruction would prevent any rational intelligence operation. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, personally reviewed cable security assessments. His staff reported that underwater cables represented the most secure communication method available. The report concluded that American intelligence agencies lack the capability to conduct operations at the required depth in hostile waters without detection. The report reached its conclusions in 1970. 1 year later, USS Halibut proved every conclusion wrong. USS Halibut, hull number SSGN 587, commissioned in 1960 as a guided missile submarine carrying Regulus cruise missiles. The submarine was obsolete by 1965 when the Regulus program ended, replaced by Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Rather than decommission the boat, the United States Navy converted it for special operations. The conversion transformed Halibut into a unique intelligence collection platform. Engineers removed the missile hangar and installed a saturation diving chamber capable of supporting divers at extreme depths for extended periods. Manipulator arms replaced missile guidance systems. Deep-sea cameras and lighting systems were installed throughout the forward section. A lockout chamber allowed divers to exit the submarine while it remained submerged. The modifications turned Halibut into something unprecedented in naval history. A submarine capable of conducting covert deep-sea operations in hostile waters for extended periods without support vessels or surface presence. The saturation diving system was critical to the mission. Conventional diving limited bottom time based on decompression requirements. Divers working at 400 feet could only remain at depth for minutes before requiring hours of decompression. Saturation diving solved this limitation by keeping divers at pressure equivalent to working depth for days or weeks. They lived in a pressurized chamber aboard the submarine, breathing helium-oxygen mixtures. When work required, they transferred to the lockout chamber and exited the submarine without additional compression time. Working at 400 feet in near-freezing water with limited visibility required exceptional skill. The divers were Navy SEALs and deep-sea specialists trained for conditions that would kill most people within minutes. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Equipment failure meant death. But the intelligence value justified the risk. The first Operation Ivy Bells mission in October 1971 proved the concept. Halibut located the Soviet cable using intelligence provided by the National Security Agency. NSA analysts had studied satellite photographs, monitored Soviet naval operations, and deduced cable routes through analysis of communication patterns. When Soviet vessels remained stationary for extended periods near shore, communications continued uninterrupted, indicating the presence of cables rather than radio links. The divers attached the recording pod in a 4-hour operation. The device was ingenious in its simplicity. Induction coils wrapped around the cable without penetrating the protective sheathing. The electromagnetic field generated by signals passing through the conductors induced corresponding currents in the coils. These currents were amplified, filtered, and recorded on magnetic tape. The system captured everything: voice communications, teletype data, telemetry signals, encrypted messages. The encryption didn't matter for many purposes. Traffic analysis, examining who communicated with whom, when, and how frequently, revealed operational patterns without decrypting the content. When submarine commanders received lengthy encrypted messages followed immediately by submarines departing port, the pattern indicated deployment orders regardless of encryption. USS Halibut returned to the Sea of Okhotsk in October 1972 to retrieve the first recording pod and install a replacement. The operation required 6 days in Soviet waters. Divers recovered the pod, installed fresh equipment, and departed without detection. The retrieved tapes contained 1 year of Soviet Pacific Fleet communications. NSA analysts spent months processing the recordings. The intelligence value exceeded the most optimistic predictions. Soviet submarine patrol schedules were documented in detail. fleet exercises were coordinated through cable communications. Maintenance schedules and readiness reports revealed weaknesses in Soviet naval operations. Command relationships showed which officers made operational decisions and which merely forwarded orders from Moscow. The operation continued annually throughout the 1970s. USS Halibut made multiple trips to the Sea of Okhotsk, each time retrieving the previous year's recordings and installing fresh equipment. Soviet counterintelligence never detected the intrusions. The cable showed no interruptions. Service continued normally. The KGB had no indication that American submarines were operating in Soviet territorial waters, conducting the most successful intelligence collection operation of the Cold War. In 1980, USS Parche replaced USS Halibut for Operation Ivy Bell's missions. Parche was a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine, hull number SSN 683, modified extensively for intelligence operations. The modifications were classified at the time and remain partially classified today, but publicly available information describes a dry deck shelter mounted on the submarine's hull capable of housing a submersible vehicle, advanced manipulator arms, and sophisticated electronics for intelligence collection. USS Parche represented the evolution of submarine espionage. While Halibut proved the concept, Parche refined it. The submarine could remain on station longer, work at greater depths, and conduct more complex operations. The crew was specially selected and trained for intelligence missions. Security clearances exceeded normal submarine operations. The missions Parche conducted remained classified decades after completion. But Operation Ivy Bells continued. USS Parche serviced the recording pods in the Sea of Okhotsk, retrieving data and installing new equipment. The intelligence continued flowing to NSA headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland. Soviet Pacific Fleet communications remained completely compromised, and Soviet counterintelligence remained completely unaware. The risks were extraordinary. If Soviet forces detected the submarine, international incident would be certain. If divers were captured, their mission would be exposed. If the recording pods were discovered, the entire operation would collapse. But the intelligence value justified every risk. The intelligence collected through Operation Ivy Bells from 1971 to 1980 provided comprehensive understanding of Soviet Pacific Fleet operations. American analysts knew submarine deployment schedules before Soviet submarines departed port. Surface ship movements were predicted days in advance based on communication patterns. Missile test schedules were known to American intelligence before Soviet technicians completed fueling procedures. This intelligence enabled the United States Navy to position assets strategically. American attack submarines could intercept Soviet ballistic missile submarines leaving port because communication intercepts revealed deployment orders. Surface vessels could track Soviet fleet exercises because cable communications coordinated the exercises in advance. Intelligence aircraft could position for optimal collection during missile tests because telemetry coordination passed through the tapped cables. Arms control verification benefited enormously from Ivy Bell's intelligence. When Soviet leadership claimed compliance with missile test limitations, NSA analysts could verify claims against actual test schedules revealed in cable communications. When Soviet admirals reported fleet readiness levels to political leadership, American intelligence knew whether the reports were accurate based on maintenance communications and readiness assessments transmitted through the cables. The cables carried communications that Soviet commanders assumed were completely secure. They discussed operational problems candidly. They reported equipment failures honestly. They coordinated activities with detail that would never appear in radio traffic subject to American interception. The cable tap provided insight into Soviet naval operations at a level that no other intelligence source could match. Traffic analysis proved particularly valuable even when encryption prevented reading message content. Soviet submarine commanders received lengthy encrypted messages at specific times before departing port. The pattern indicated deployment orders. The length of messages correlated with mission complexity. Short messages meant routine patrols. Lengthy messages meant special operations or ballistic missile patrols. American intelligence could assess Soviet submarine activity without breaking encryption simply by analyzing communication patterns. The recording pods operated continuously from 1971 to 1980, collecting thousands of hours of communications. NSA maintained dedicated teams to process Ivy Bell's materials. The analysts learned to recognize individual Soviet communicators by voice patterns and speech habits. They identified which officers held actual decision-making authority versus those who merely forwarded instructions from higher command. They mapped the Soviet Pacific Fleet command structure in detail that Soviet security officers would have found horrifying. USS Parche conducted 7 successful missions to service the cable taps between 1980 and 1981. Each mission required approximately 2 weeks in Soviet waters. The submarine approached the Sea of Okhotsk through narrow straits, transited to the cable location while evading Soviet patrol assets, deployed divers to service equipment, and withdrew undetected. The operations demanded extraordinary skill from the crew and exceptional luck regarding Soviet patrol schedules. Commander Frank Otto, commanding officer of USS Parche during this period, later stated that submarine intelligence operations combined traditional submarine warfare skills with techniques that had more in common with burglary than combat. The submarine had to enter restricted waters, conduct covert activities without leaving evidence, and depart without being detected. Detection meant mission failure, even if the submarine escaped safely. The intelligence bonanza ended in 1980 when Ronald Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. Ronald William Pelton joined the National Security Agency in 1965 as a communications specialist. He held top-secret security clearances with special compartmented access to signals intelligence programs. His work involved processing intercepted communications and maintaining secure communication systems. He had access to some of the most sensitive intelligence programs in the American government. Pelton left NSA employment in 1979 after 14 years of service. His financial situation was poor. He had declared bankruptcy. His marriage was failing. He needed money desperately. In January 1980, he entered the Soviet embassy in Washington and offered to sell classified information to the KGB. The KGB conducted extensive debriefings over several meetings. Pelton described numerous NSA operations, but the program that most interested Soviet intelligence officers was Operation Ivy Bells. Pelton provided specific details: the location of the tapped cables in the Sea of Okhotsk, the type of recording devices used, the submarines conducting the operations, the frequency of servicing missions. The KGB paid Pelton $35,000 total for information that had cost the United States billions to collect and was worth incalculable strategic value. Pelton's motivation was purely financial. He made no ideological claims. He simply needed money and was willing to betray his country to get it. Soviet naval intelligence dispatched divers to the cable location in summer 1981. They located the recording pod exactly where Pelton described. The device was carefully recovered and transported to Moscow for analysis. Soviet engineers examined it thoroughly, determining how the induction system worked and confirming that the cable had been tapped for years without detection. The Soviet Union displayed portions of the recording pod at press conferences in 1981 as evidence of American espionage. Soviet media proclaimed it proof of American violations of international law and Soviet sovereignty. The propaganda value was significant, but the intelligence damage was already complete. 9 years of Soviet Pacific Fleet communications had been recorded, analyzed, and used to maintain American naval superiority. Soviet communication security procedures changed immediately. Cables were buried deeper. Additional shielding was installed. Monitoring equipment was placed near cables to detect unusual magnetic fields. Soviet submarine patrols in the Sea of Okhotsk intensified, but the damage couldn't be undone. American submarines continued intelligence operations despite the compromise. USS Parche shifted to other mission areas where Soviet security remained inadequate. The submarine conducted classified operations throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The specific nature of these missions remains classified, but USS Parche received Presidential Unit citations more frequently than any other ship in United States Navy history. By the time of decommissioning in 2004, Parche had received 10 Presidential Unit citations, an unprecedented number reflecting extraordinary achievements in missions that may never be publicly acknowledged. The FBI began investigating Pelton in 1985 after a defecting KGB officer provided information about an NSA employee who had sold secrets. The investigation identified Pelton through the defector's descriptions and evidence of his financial transactions with Soviet intelligence. Pelton was arrested in November 1985. The trial revealed extensive details about Operation Ivy Bells, much to the dismay of intelligence officials who preferred the program remain classified. Pelton was convicted on 4 counts of espionage in June 1986 and sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences plus 10 years. He remained imprisoned until 2015, when he was released on parole at age 74. The trial judge noted that Pelton had compromised intelligence operations worth billions of dollars and damaged American national security significantly. The intelligence that USS Halibut and USS Parche collected over 9 years provided advantages that affected American military planning, submarine operations, and strategic decisions throughout the Cold War. Pelton sold all of it for $35,000. Operation Ivy Bells demonstrated that American submarine capabilities extended far beyond traditional warfare roles. Submarines could conduct covert intelligence operations in hostile waters at depths and locations that Soviet security planners considered impossible. The combination of submarine stealth, saturation diving techniques, sophisticated recording equipment, and NSA analysis created an intelligence collection capability that the Soviet Union never successfully countered. The broader implications extended beyond one tapped cable. If American submarines could operate undetected in the Sea of Okhotsk, which Soviet planners considered their most secure maritime area, then no Soviet naval facility was truly safe from American intelligence collection. Cables in the Barents Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea were all potentially vulnerable to similar operations. Soviet naval communications shifted increasingly to radio and satellite links after the Ivy Bells compromise, but these systems were even more vulnerable to American signals intelligence. The NSA maintained extensive networks of ground stations, ships, aircraft, and satellites dedicated to intercepting Soviet communications. Radio traffic that could be intercepted from hundreds of miles away was actually less secure than cables that required submarines to enter hostile waters and deploy divers. The technological evolution continued throughout the 1980s and beyond. Recording pods became more sophisticated, with digital storage replacing magnetic tape. Power systems improved, allowing longer operational periods between servicing. Induction systems became more sensitive, capable of detecting weaker signals through heavier shielding. American intelligence agencies adapted to Soviet countermeasures faster than Soviet security forces could implement new protections. Modern fiber optic cables present different challenges than the coaxial cables of the 1970s. Fiber optics carry signals as light pulses rather than electrical currents, reducing electromagnetic emissions that induction coils detect. But intelligence agencies have developed techniques to access fiber optic communications through methods that remain classified. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. Submarine-delivered intelligence collection systems can access communications that adversaries assume are secure. USS Parche's operational history after 1981 remains largely classified. The submarine received Presidential Unit citations in 1991, 1992, 1994, 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998, 2000, and 2003, suggesting a sustained pattern of successful classified missions throughout the post-Cold War period. The specific operations that earned these citations may never be publicly revealed, but the frequency and consistency indicate that submarine intelligence collection remained viable and valuable long after Operation Ivy Bells ended. The submarine was decommissioned in 2004 after nearly 30 years of service. At the decommissioning ceremony, senior naval officers praised Parche's contributions to national security without providing specific details. The submarine's name lives on in official histories as the most decorated vessel in United States Navy history, but the full scope of its achievements remains classified decades later. Modern American submarine forces continue intelligence operations using techniques descended from Operation Ivy Bells. Virginia-class attack submarines include provisions for special operations forces and intelligence collection equipment. The specific capabilities remain classified, but the missions continue. Underwater intelligence collection remains a core mission for American submarine forces because it provides intelligence that cannot be obtained through any other means. Soviet and later Russian naval forces learned bitter lessons from the Ivy Bells compromise. No communication system is truly secure if an adversary has sufficient technical capability and operational boldness. The seafloor is not an impenetrable barrier. Geography provides limited protection against submarines that can operate anywhere. Depth is not security against nations with advanced diving technology and sophisticated equipment. The intelligence value of Operation Ivy Bells cannot be precisely calculated, but the strategic advantages it provided were immense. For 9 years, American military planners knew Soviet Pacific Fleet operations in detail. Submarine deployments were tracked, surface ship movements were predicted, missile tests were monitored, command relationships were mapped, operational procedures were documented. Every aspect of Soviet naval operations in the Pacific was compromised. That intelligence enabled the United States Navy to maintain superiority despite Soviet numerical advantages. American submarines could intercept Soviet boats because intelligence revealed their routes and schedules. American surface forces could avoid Soviet exercises because cable communications provided advance warning. American missile defense could prepare for tests because telemetry coordination passed through tapped cables. The investment in Operation Ivy Bells, specialized submarines, trained crews, sophisticated equipment, extensive NSA analysis, returned intelligence value far exceeding the cost. One operation provided comprehensive insight into Soviet naval operations for nearly a decade. No satellite system, no spy network, no signals intelligence station could match the detail and reliability of intelligence collected directly from Soviet military cables. Ronald Pelton's betrayal highlighted the insider threat that intelligence agencies face constantly. The most sophisticated technical operations can be compromised by a single person with access and motivation. Pelton had legitimate access to classified information. His security clearance had been properly granted based on background investigations, but personal financial problems drove him to betray his country for money that wouldn't even pay off his debts. The damage Pelton caused extended beyond Operation Ivy Bells. He compromised other NSA programs that remain classified. He provided Soviet intelligence with information about American signals, intelligence capabilities that took years to rebuild. His betrayal damaged national security in ways that may never be fully understood, because some of the programs he compromised remain classified decades later. The investigation that caught Pelton demonstrated that counterintelligence eventually succeeds, but the damage occurs first. 9 years of intelligence was collected before Pelton sold the secret. 5 more years passed before he was arrested. The Soviet Union had ample time to change procedures, improve security, and eliminate vulnerabilities. American intelligence agencies had to develop new methods and access new sources to replace what Pelton had compromised. USS Parche and the crews who served aboard became symbols of silent service. The submarine conducted missions that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The sailors who risked their lives in operations that remain classified received recognition only within the intelligence community. Medals were awarded in closed ceremonies. Citations referenced achievements without describing them. Families learned years later what their loved ones had actually done during deployments officially described as routine patrols. The balance between operational security and public recognition remains challenging for intelligence operations. USS Parche's achievements deserved recognition, but describing those achievements would reveal capabilities that needed to remain classified. The compromise was minimal acknowledgement. Presidential unit citations without detailed explanations, references to intelligence operations without specifics, praise for contributions to national security, without describing what those contributions were. The physical remnants of Operation Ivy Bells exist in classified storage. the recording pods retrieved from Soviet cables, the equipment used by divers, the analysis documents produced by NSA, all remain classified decades after the operation ended. Some materials may eventually be declassified as historical documents, but others will likely remain secret indefinitely because they reveal technical capabilities that remain relevant to current operations. The technical achievement represented by Operation Ivy Bells deserves recognition even without complete disclosure. Conducting saturation diving operations at 400 feet depth in hostile waters required extraordinary skill. Developing recording equipment that could survive underwater pressure, extreme cold, and corrosive seawater for months at a time demonstrated engineering excellence. Processing thousands of hours of communications intercepts and extracting intelligence from encrypted traffic required analytical capability that few organizations possessed. The operational boldness was equally impressive. American submarines operated in the Sea of Okhotsk, despite Soviet naval patrols, coastal radar coverage, and acoustic sensors. The missions required transiting narrow straits where Soviet forces could easily detect and engage submarines. The operations lasted days or weeks in waters where detection meant certain capture or destruction. The crews accepted these risks because the intelligence value justified the danger. The strategic impact shaped the Cold War in ways that only became apparent years later. American confidence in naval superiority rested partially on intelligence advantages that Soviet commanders didn't know existed. American submarine forces operated with detailed knowledge of Soviet deployments, schedules, and procedures. American naval strategy incorporated intelligence that revealed Soviet weaknesses and limitations. The imbalance in naval power reflected not just ships and weapons, but information advantages gained through operations like Ivy Bells. The lessons from Operation Ivy Bells remain relevant today. Technical innovation creates intelligence opportunities that adversaries don't anticipate. Operational boldness enables missions that conventional planning considers impossible. Integration of collection platforms and analysis capabilities multiplies effectiveness. Investment in specialized capabilities provides returns far exceeding cost, and insider threats remain the most dangerous vulnerability facing any intelligence operation. The Sea of Okhotsk today looks much as it did in 1971. Soviet facilities are now Russian facilities. The cables that once carried Soviet Pacific Fleet communications now carry Russian naval traffic. Security has improved, but whether it's adequate against modern American intelligence capabilities remains classified. What is known is that USS Parche received presidential unit citations throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, suggesting that submarine intelligence operations continued successfully long after Operation Ivy Bells ended. The specific operations that earned those citations remain secret, but the pattern suggests that the principles established by Ivy Bells, submarine-delivered intelligence collection in hostile waters targeting communication systems assumed to be secure, remained viable and valuable. The Soviet Union believed underwater cables were absolutely secure. The cables lay too deep for divers to reach. They ran through restricted Soviet waters protected by naval forces. They carried encrypted communications that couldn't be read even if intercepted. Every assumption reflected reasonable security analysis based on known capabilities and existing threats. USS Halibut and USS Parche proved every assumption wrong. American submarines could reach the cables. American divers could work at those depths. American recording equipment could capture signals without interrupting service. American analysts could extract intelligence from the recordings even without breaking encryption. The gap between Soviet assumptions and American capabilities created an intelligence opportunity that was exploited successfully for 9 years. The operation ended when a trusted employee sold the secret for $35,000. The betrayal revealed the vulnerability that no technical security measure can completely eliminate: the insider threat. But by the time the secret was sold, 9 years of intelligence had been collected, analyzed, and used. The strategic advantages gained during those 9 years couldn't be reversed by Soviet countermeasures. The KGB learned that American intelligence agencies possessed capabilities that Soviet security planners hadn't anticipated. American submarines could operate undetected in waters considered secure. American divers could conduct operations at depths considered impossible. American equipment could survive conditions considered prohibitive. The intelligence collection methods considered theoretical were actually operational. Soviet naval commanders learned that their most secure communications weren't secure. The cables they trusted completely had been compromised for years. The operational security they assumed was adequate had failed to detect American operations conducted literally in Soviet territorial waters. The command decisions they made based on assumed security were being read by American intelligence within weeks of transmission. The broader lesson affected Soviet military planning across all domains. If communications cables were vulnerable, what else was vulnerable? If American submarines could operate in the Sea of Okhotsk, where else were they operating? If intelligence collected over 9 years hadn't been detected until a traitor revealed it, what other operations remained undetected? The doubt created by Operation Ivy Bells corroded Soviet confidence in their own security measures. Every communication system became suspect. Every secure facility seemed potentially compromised. Every classified operation might be known to American intelligence. The psychological impact of discovering that absolute security was impossible affected Soviet decision-making in ways that extended far beyond the immediate intelligence compromise. For the United States Navy, Operation Ivy Bells validated submarine capabilities beyond traditional combat roles. Submarines were not just weapon platforms for hunting enemy vessels and launching attacks. They were intelligence collection platforms capable of conducting covert operations in hostile waters that no other system could match. The investment in specialized submarines, trained crews, and sophisticated equipment was justified by intelligence returns that affected strategic planning and operational decisions throughout the Cold War. USS Parche's legacy as the most decorated ship in United States Navy history reflects achievements that may never be fully revealed. 10 Presidential Unit citations represent extraordinary success in missions that remain classified decades after completion. The crews who served aboard Parche conducted operations that shaped American national security in ways they couldn't discuss even with their families. Silent service took on meaning beyond the traditional submarine force motto. The technical capabilities developed for Operation Ivy Bells evolved into systems that remain operational today. The specific techniques are classified, but the principles endure. Submarines can access communications that adversaries assume are secure. Intelligence collection at the source provides information that no other method can obtain. Operational boldness combined with technical excellence creates strategic advantages that last for years. The Soviet Union built underwater cables to carry their most sensitive military communications. They assumed geography, depth, and security measures made those cables invulnerable to American intelligence. USS Halibut and USS Parche spent 9 years proving them wrong. American divers worked at 400 feet depth in freezing water, attaching recording devices to cables in Soviet territorial waters. NSA analysts processed thousands of hours of intercepted communications, extracting intelligence that shaped American naval strategy throughout the Cold War. The KGB never suspected until a traitor walked into their embassy and sold the secret for $35,000. By then, 9 years of Soviet Pacific Fleet communications had been recorded, analyzed, and exploited. The damage couldn't be undone. The intelligence advantages gained during those 9 years contributed to American naval superiority that the Soviet Union never overcame. Soviet security planners believed that the sea floor at 400 feet depth in restricted Soviet waters was beyond American reach. They were wrong. The gap wasn't cable depth or encryption strength or geographic protection. The gap was American submarine technology combined with saturation diving capability, sophisticated recording equipment, NSA analytical expertise, and operational courage that turned the ocean floor into an intelligence collection platform that operated successfully for 9 years in the most secure Soviet naval area. The Soviet Union planned their communication security for threats they understood. America collected their most sensitive military communications, using techniques the Soviets never anticipated. When the secret was finally revealed, the strategic damage was already done.